Today, in Richard Thinks Tanks Could Be More Exciting, I'm building a scale model. This is actually my first scale model in ever, effectively. I think I did like one when I was a little kid. So the motivation to make this model is, one, I've got a paint booth. I actually did a Settlers of Catan game over the winter, and it was a lot of fun to paint those pieces. So I'm hoping to recreate that entertainment, although with a lot less 3D printing, since this was a budget model that I picked up off Amazon. Furthermore, when I say tanks are boring, I mean the olive green color scheme is kind of boring. Don't get me wrong, it's really cool to have a model that looks true to form. But in order to spice things up a little bit, I want to make some cool colors, make a unique look. And so I'm actually going to take some inspiration from the Warhammer 40k universe. I'll pick one of the Space Marines factions and use their color scheme to paint this tank. The first step is to wash the parts in order to remove the injection molding release agent. I used my ultrasonic cleaner with a bath of 10:1 diluted simple green, followed by a simple rinse in tap water. After their quick bubble bath, I started cutting parts off of their sprues with my rusty razor knife. For this quality of model, I found that a quick filing after pulling the part off the sprue is sufficient to clean up rough edges. More importantly, I realized about halfway through the model that the sprues have numbers, and you really should only remove parts once you know where on the model they're going to go, so you don't get lost. The wheels were the first parts assembled, went together pretty well, although once everything was glued together, I realized that the wheels didn't line up very well in the direction of the vehicle, the longitudinal directional. And ultimately, it did interfere with the installation of the tracks at the end of the assembly. I'm unsure how I would have resolved this if I was able to do the model again. Maybe just paying closer attention when gluing. Assembling the body of the tank is similar to gluing a box together, but when there's no overlap on the corners, so the glue is the only thing holding everything together. After gluing the wheel assembly onto the tank's belly, the tank top didn't fit well. I luckily caught it fast enough where the glue was still drying. I was able to pull off one side with the wheels and try again. It might have been easier to first attach the sides of the tank onto the top of the tank. There was a slight overhang, and that might have helped align the part. But overall, I think on this cheap model, this step is going to be tricky no matter how you do it. So be patient, be quick actually, so that you can catch glue drying, and good luck. The instructions point to the fuel drums next. They require a lot of cleanup in order to make it look like a smooth cylinder, and unknown to me, they should be applied to the model after the turret is installed. Otherwise, you cannot get the larger turret to fit on the tank. This is also the point where the instructions say to apply these little bars on the outsides. I'm not sure what they are. They might be like ammo boxes. Really, they remind me of pool noodles, and they probably are used in case the tank has to bump into another tank and you just want a nice soft collision. The next doodad on the tank are the exhaust ports in the rear. They're not fragile, but be careful. And then beyond them, there's little wheel covers that go on the bottom of the tank. I actually don't really know what they do. They seem weird that there's a part dedicated to that, but got the part, put it on the tank. The instructions actually show to install the treads as step 4. However, all I did was clean them up a little bit, and I wanted to paint the tank before installing the treads, so they went off to the side. And then it was on to assembling the turrets. There's actually 2 turrets in this kit, which is really cool. There's the 76mm gun and the 85mm gun. I eventually opted to go with the 76. I think it looks a little bit cooler, but I assembled both to try to get a good fitment. These parts went together poorly for the most part. However, it doesn't help that I was backwards when I assembled the larger turret, and I assembled it upside down. You can't assemble it upside down, but you can have the gun pointed straight into the ground, which looks silly. In the paint booth, I get to start deciding on my paint scheme. So I was able to find some line art online of the T34, and that allowed me to pull out my crayons from the dollar store and get to designing a paint scheme. If I hadn't been able to find that line art, I would have probably found an image online and then cranked up the contrast, turned it to grayscale, and found a similar analog, but this was ideal. After selecting the Bumblebee type paint scheme, I also made some quick notes on a 7-step process to painting the tank that I plan to attack with a primer, a dark yellow for shading, a bright yellow on the highlight features just from directly above on the tank, and then to go over with the base coat, all of this airbrushed, followed by applying black and brushed details. Writing out a plan like this really helps me stay focused and not lose track while I'm going through. And especially when you're switching from a yellow to a black paint, it is much harder to apply yellow paint on top of black paint. You really don't want to get that wrong. Here I opted to finally glue the turret in place. This would be the last assembly step. Aside from the tank treads, those go on last. The reason I took so long to install the turret was that I was indecisive between the two sizes of turrets. The smaller 76mm turret, that has very few overhangs, and so there's no issue painting around it. If I had opted for the larger turret, then I probably would have wanted to completely paint it before installation so that I could get into the small recesses easily. Furthermore, once I installed it, I realized that there was going to be some gaps, specifically the key that allows you to put the turret in place. That was too big. I was able to cover that up with some school glue, and I went around and tried to just smooth out some imprecise features. This would not have worked on any larger gaps in the tank. Ultimately, I don't have any sort of, well, I have construction putty somewhere in my house, but nothing for modeling. While I own an airbrush, that does not demonstrate any degree of knowledge in this. It was more of a whim purchase, and now I get to use it. I do enjoy it, but we're learning together. So the first coat is the primer. I use a Vallejo primer. It's probably the only paint that I really spent money on because you're going to use it on pretty much every single model. And this goes on pretty well. I also add a little bit of airbrush thinner to thin out any paints, including the primer, and that helps it spray better without clogging the nozzle. Again, I'm still a novice at airbrushing, so take this advice at your own risk. When I'm switching colors, not doing a hard clean, I pour out any remaining paint as long as it's not been mixed, so that's the same shade. Here, the primer's unmixed aside from a little bit of flow improver, so that goes back in the bottle. In order to clean the airbrush, I use Windex, like a window cleaner, in a spray bottle to rinse out the cup and pour out any excess. And then I also use just regular tap water as a flushing agent. And I do this probably 4 or 5 times in order to try to clean it out as best as possible. I also keep Q-tips on hand, and that allows me to get to the bottom of the bowl and really try to get any paint that's at the bottom, and also clean away around the nozzle, because those are the locations where paint really sticks around. During my cleaning, I also keep in mind what's going in the paintbrush next. For example, if you're going from a light shade of yellow to a dark shade of yellow, it's less critical because they're both shades of yellow and you won't notice a large distinction between the two. But if you're shooting red immediately after shooting green, then honestly, I would tear down the the airbrush entirely for that and run it through the ultrasonic cleaner, because I don't want any red or any green contaminating the other color. It is obvious when that mistake is made. The first color to be applied is a dark yellow. I'm using a mustard yellow from Craftsmart along with a burnt umber from American Deco. These are cheap craft paints, and honestly, I probably should be spending money on real paints. When I apply paints into the airbrush, I usually put a bit of water down to try to flood the area where the needle is. And then I apply paints here, more yellow than brown. I believe the technique that I'm pursuing here is called pre-shading. I stumbled upon a YouTube video about it a few years back. Effectively, you're trying to go over with a slightly darker and slightly brighter colors in the relevant areas before applying your base coat, so it should make a relatively smooth transition. In my experience in this model, I actually really liked how it performed around the tank treads and these difficult to reach areas. The airbrush lets you get behind the wheels and get nice even coverage, and the darker paints do create a little bit of a shadow there. After the dark yellow dries, I apply a lighter yellow as a highlighting agent. This is just the same color of yellow with some white in order to add a highlighting. And this is purely highlighting as if it's the sun hitting it. So a top-down, broad coat. And I'll let the final model be the judge, but I had a hard time establishing high value out of this step. If I was to skip any step of the painting process, I think this pre-shading with the light is less valuable than the pre-shading with the darks. And more airbrushing, this time with just the base shade of mustard yellow. I enjoy airbrushing. I actually found this quite enjoyable to sit and make a nice smooth color across the entire tank. With the base coat applied, I now am breaking down my airbrush for a full wash. So I do leverage my ultrasonic cleaner. I think it makes life a lot easier with these devices where there's always paint in some nook and cranny. I did 3D print a little cradle for all the parts. Specifically, the nozzle is very small and easy to lose, so don't lose that. I always keep the assembly instructions for this is the Neo for Iwata. That's on the wall of my quote-unquote paint booth. It's a table with a box fan. When it comes to reassembly, some of the items that I've learned specific to this airbrush is that the trigger, you identify which direction the trigger is supposed to sit because there's a recess at the back of the trigger. So when you pull it back, it will sit nicely on the body of the airbrush. And then similarly, there's the, I don't even know what to call that, like the spring assembly. And the S hook has to go in a certain way. I'm not going to explain in a YouTube video, but if you have the printed in assembly instructions, it should be relatively obvious which way to position that. Here's a quick close-up, a macro look at the paint finish after I've done this pre-highlighting and the overall paint airbrush scheme. So you can slightly see the top of the tank is slightly brighter. The wheels definitely have a little bit of shadow, but nothing is obvious. It's not like I have strong brush strokes across this tank, and I really like the finish that an airbrush does. Honestly, almost all the time, even with these cheap craft paints. The biggest thing with craft paints is that they can be headaches if the nozzle clogs, and then it just slows down your workflow. With airbrushing finished, it's now time to get out the paintbrushes. Again, I'm very cheap, even though I've got an airbrush. I've got a little homemade wet palette. If you're in the market, I would recommend just buying the $12 kit on Amazon. It's worth it. I also use cheap brushes from Michaels for my models. I opted to go directly to brushing the black because they're small strips of paint, and I thought it would be faster and easier. However, I do regret not trying to do a strong masking followed by airbrushing. Who knows? Maybe it would have been worse, but it was still a fun tank to paint. The stripes that I freehanded turned out much worse than the stripes that I masked. I think one of the biggest learnings that I take away from this tank is that masking is your friend, especially in large surfaces where you don't have a feature to, like an edge to butt the paint up against and use as reference. Here, even though there was the edge, whenever I deviated from the even band, it became pretty obvious very quickly. The black paint went on very smoothly and very quickly. As I moved on with the tank, I pulled out the other colors to make it look a little bit more interesting. So the pool noodles get purple, because what other color do you use? Actually, it's violet, because the tanks are violet. Either way, one of the biggest items that I learn about craft paints as I keep using them, because I have a large collection now, is that some colors apply well. The black is a good example where there's plenty of pigment and it goes on evenly. And then a lot of most colors, most other colors like this violet and then the red that I apply on the fuel canisters, it takes so many coats of paint in order to get an opaque application. It actually really slows down the application time because you have to let it dry and potentially move away to do something else. So it is a little bit of a luxury to be able to buy a cheap paint so that you have a specific color for each item. You can always come back to that exact shade instead of mixing paints, but there's still a lot of headaches associated with those craft paints. This is when I applied a quick dry brushing to the tank treads. This was very basic, just a tan in order to highlight the ridges on the tank treads. Applying some silver highlights for anything that I think should be chrome. I know it's ironic to make anything chrome or clean on a T34, but this is space T34 and it's shiny, and I think shiny is good. And I have a lot of silver paint that I still need to use. I don't even know why I bought it. And a close-up status update. This is the ending of the major painting features, so take a quick look. It's pretty obvious where I did masking, where I didn't. Even the masking didn't turn out perfectly, but it did help a lot compared to the freehand paint. I really like how silver looks on the model. It's a little over the top, but it's what I'm going for. It's supposed to be an over-the-top model. The tank treads was actually one of my most dreaded steps in the tank building process, largely because they're rubber and they're supposed to loop into each other or like create a loop through these little rubber nibs that you put into the other side, and it just doesn't work at all. So I cut those off and ended up super gluing as many points of contact as I could between the wheels and the treads. Some critical steps that I did learn is that having the treads end on one wheel or in the middle of two wheels, like in the gap, allows you to get a good interface between those two wheels and have them line up. Furthermore, I was able to use toothpicks in order to massage the treads onto the wheels, especially between the top of the wheel and the side skirt, the armor. The problem is that you're stretching the treads over this entire wheel area, and they don't naturally want to rest. They're not heavy like real steel treads, and so you have to push them down while the glue dries. And those toothpicks, I could break a little piece, slip it in there, and keep it held down while the glue dried. I opted to apply a generic brown, dark black wash. This is the same wash that's a recipe for terrain building. Um, I actually think that the results were mediocre. Yes, wash will cover a lot of sins and it will highlight recessed details. But on a tank where there's a lot of smooth surfaces, it's very hard to get the wash to dry in such a way that you don't get brush strokes. And that was a big issue that I had overall. I don't know how to counteract this because I'm not a good model builder, and I need something in order to hide sins and give more definition to the features. I think I would need to more selectively apply the wash instead of just like a broad overarching wash, and only go for maybe the wheel assembly or specific areas of the turret. The last step that I almost forgot is to apply a protective varnish. I actually use the DecoArt DuraClear Ultra Matte Polyurethane. I think it gives good results, although I haven't handled the tank very much since finishing. I do shoot it through the airbrush, which I actually have had a hard time finding any documentation on shooting a varnish through an airbrush. It worked reasonably well. I never had any jams. It applied evenly. Just varnish with some airbrush thinner. And a rotation of the finished product. I'll use this time to summarize what we've learned in this experience. So I bought a budget model, and it was entertaining to build, but it also can serve other purposes. For example, I would call this an Iron Fist paint scheme from Warhammer 40K. Feel free to disagree with me. And this would allow you to either test a new paint scheme or potentially a new technique. I learned a lot from this. I've never painted a vehicle before. Some of those learnings also was that airbrushing gives good results. I'm not completely sold on the pre-shading. I think it benefited me, but overall the wash I applied kind of negated those effects, and it added an additional 2 steps. Masking is very important, especially for large surface area. It gives much cleaner lines, and maybe I'll be able to avoid in the future with a more steady hand. And lastly, I need to figure out a better way to finalize the model. The wash just makes it look like I smothered paint over it, which is true.